The Boeing 737 sat poised on runway 18L at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, engines humming with the low, steady roar that had lulled thousands of passengers into routine comfort. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of recycled air and coffee, mingling with the subtle musk of nervous anticipation that always precedes a flight. Families adjusted their carry-ons, pilots and flight attendants ran through pre-flight checks, and passengers scrolled through their phones, headphones drowning out the mechanical symphony around them. Among them, Ethan Parker, a 22-year-old engineering student from Austin, clutched a worn leather notebook to his chest. His eyes darted over the pages, filled with sketches of drone mechanisms and theoretical calculations, his mind half on the flight and half on the midterm exam he'd aced only hours before. Ethan wasn't just any student. He had a fascination with aviation that went far beyond casual interest. Since the age of 10, he had built model airplanes, modified drones, and spent hours in flight simulators, learning to manipulate controls, respond to emergencies, and manage situations that no ordinary civilian would ever face. He had never imagined that knowledge would ever matter outside the glow of his computer screen, until now. As the cabin crew signaled the final call to fasten seatbelts, Ethan felt a flicker of anxiety. Something in the air was off. The engines hummed in a slightly uneven tone. He shook his head, dismissing it as overthinking. The plane taxied forward, the wheels squealing against the asphalt. Passengers leaned forward, eyes glued to the runway lights that stretched into the dusk. A mother held her child tightly, murmuring words of comfort that barely masked her own tension. An elderly couple held hands, knuckles white, whispering prayers that had been rehearsed for decades. The mundane chaos of pre-flight chatter, seatbelt clicks, and rolling luggage filled the cabin with normality, comforting, reassuring, and fragile. Ethan adjusted his seat, taking a deep breath. His mind wandered briefly to home, his family, his younger sister's mischievous smile, the dog he'd left tied in the backyard. He thought about the late nights studying, the professors who had doubted him, and the thrill of finally proving himself in engineering competitions. He imagined the warm sun of Texas on his skin and the cold soda waiting in his apartment fridge. Life was predictable, safe, normal. And yet, in that calm, he couldn't shake a peculiar sense of anticipation, an instinct honed through years of simulations that often whispered something coming. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 372, Dallas to Los Angeles. We're expecting smooth skies and clear weather. Please remain seated until the fasten seatbelt sign is off. Thank you for flying with us today." The voice was calm, authoritative, and meant to comfort, but for Ethan, it did nothing to quell the flutter of unease in his stomach. Minutes after takeoff, the Boeing lifted gracefully into the evening sky. Lights twinkled below as the city fell away into the sprawling darkness of the Texas plains. The hum of engines was steady and the turbulence was minimal, almost laughably gentle. Ethan relaxed, letting his notebook rest on his lap. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. For once it seemed the flight was ordinary, predictable, safe. Then, without warning, it happened. A deafening bang ripped through the aircraft. Windows rattled violently. Passengers screamed instinctively, throwing drinks and bags across the cabin. A flash of orange and black smoke erupted from the port engine. The plane jolted sideways, throwing Ethan forward into his seatbelt. The safety harness dug into his chest, but he barely noticed. Time slowed. He could hear the wails of passengers, the frantic shouting of flight attendants, and the high-pitched alarm of the cockpit warning system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," shouted a flight attendant, though her own voice trembled. She gripped the rails with white-knuckled fingers as the plane shuddered violently. Bags spilled from the overhead compartments, and children cried out in terror. Ethan's mind, however, shifted instantly into calculated observation. His hands gripped the armrests. He scanned the cabin. A woman had hit her head on the overhead bin. A man's glasses had fallen onto the floor. A toddler screamed for his mother. He mentally cataloged hazards, anticipating where chaos might escalate next. And then came the second bang. The starboard engine exploded, sending a shockwave through the fuselage. Smoke filled the cabin as the emergency oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Passengers scrambled to pull them on, coughing, eyes wide with panic. The smell of burning fuel invaded the air. The plane lurched downward sharply, and a collective gasp echoed from every row. Ethan felt the familiar surge of fear, but he didn't panic. His simulation-trained mind began calculating trajectories, angles of descent, and potential fields for emergency landing. The students, the families, the tourists, everyone's life now depended on split-second decisions that seemed impossible. Around him, the cabin was a storm of panic. A young mother clutched her infant so tightly it was as if she feared the child might vanish if she let go. An elderly man clutched his wife's hand, murmuring prayers through trembling lips. Flight attendants yelled instructions, but the plane's violent rocking made coherent communication almost impossible. Ethan shouted above the chaos, his voice sharp and commanding. "Everyone, stay calm. Buckle up tight, hold onto your seats, don't fight the plane." His words cut through the fear. Some turned to him, eyes wide with disbelief, seeing a calm young man amid what seemed like certain doom. From the cockpit, a distorted voice barely managed to break through the intercom. Both engines, failure, were losing power. The words were punctuated by a violent jolt that made the overhead compartments rattle like thunder. Ethan's stomach dropped. He knew the probability of surviving a double-engine failure on a fully loaded 737 was minimal. His heart raced, but his hands were steady. Years of simulations and engineering studies converged into a single, desperate realization. He might have to act, and he might have to act now. A woman screamed, "We're going to die," across the aisle. Ethan turned to her, eyes locked on hers, and said firmly, "No, listen to me. We're not done yet. We can survive this. I promise you we can survive this." His words didn't erase the fear, but they sparked a fragile thread of hope. Around him, passengers clung tighter, some whispering prayers, others muttering under their breath in disbelief. The plane continued its wild, unpredictable descent. And then Ethan's gaze snapped to the cockpit door. The captain's voice came through again, this time trembling even more. I can't stabilize." The words cut off abruptly, replaced by a roar as the aircraft jolted violently, nearly throwing passengers from their seats. Ethan's mind raced. He knew he had to reach the cockpit. He had to see for himself, had to act, because if the pilots couldn't regain control, everyone on board would die. Sweat streaked his forehead as he prepared to move, the weight of 180 lives pressing down on him like a physical force. Each second was an eternity. The plane shuddered again, and a fiery spark from the engines cast dancing shadows across terrified faces. The seatbelt sign blinked violently, flashing like a warning he could not ignore. Ethan's stomach twisted, but his resolve solidified. He was no longer a student worrying about finals or deadlines. He was a human being staring death in the face, and he refused to back down. As he unbuckled his seatbelt and began moving toward the cockpit, the roar of the failing engines grew louder. Sparks erupted from the wings. The fuselage creaked ominously, and in that moment, Ethan knew that the next few seconds would define whether he would live, or whether the lives of everyone on this plane would be snuffed out in a fiery instant. The roar of the engines intensified. The cabin pitched violently, and the impossible realization hit him. This wasn't a drill, this was real, and survival depended on him. The plane shuddered violently as Ethan crawled forward through the aisle, his legs pressed tight against the floor to maintain balance. Overhead bins rattled open, sending backpacks and jackets tumbling into the screaming passengers below. The smell of burning fuel thickened the air, mingling with the panic-driven cries that filled the cabin. Mothers clutched infants to their chests. Elderly passengers gripped the seats in front of them as though their lives depended on it. In a split second, Ethan's mind cataloged every hazard: the falling luggage, the swinging armrests, the people too terrified to move. Stay calm," he shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. Some heads turned toward him wide-eyed as though a beacon of control had suddenly appeared in the hurricane of fear. He didn't have time to pause. He moved quickly, dodging a suitcase that skidded across the aisle and reached a young woman who had slipped under the seat in front of her. "Come on," he urged, grabbing her wrist and pulling her to her feet. "Hold on tight." The plane lurched violently again, and Ethan's stomach dropped with it. The roaring of the engines had become a horrific, unnatural howl, punctuated by sparks and smoke that leaked into the cabin from the wings. Oxygen masks dangled like pendulums from the ceiling, some passengers fumbling to secure them. A little boy, no older than 6, sobbed as his mother struggled to get the mask over his small face. Ethan grabbed it in a single motion, slipping it over the boy's mouth, and felt the tiny hands clutch his arm in fear. Flight attendants were moving through the cabin, shouting instructions, their faces pale, eyes wide. They tried to maintain order, but every sudden jolt sent passengers tumbling against the walls or into one another. Ethan noticed a man pinned against the window, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He rushed to help, straining against the motion of the plane. "You're going to be okay," he assured him, though his own heart was hammering. Time had slowed and accelerated all at once. Every second seemed to stretch into an eternity. From the cockpit came another shuddering, frantic voice. "We're losing altitude faster than anticipated. Both engines failure confirmed." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He glanced at the passengers around him, eyes wide, mouths open, some chanting prayers, others frozen in disbelief. He knew that most of them had no idea what a total engine failure meant, what the odds were, what the mechanics involved. But Ethan knew. Years of drone flying simulations, hours spent analyzing engine failure scenarios, had honed his mind for this exact kind of impossibility. He paused for a fraction of a second, scanning the cabin. Every detail mattered. Loose items could become projectiles. Terrified passengers could inadvertently block the aisles. The oxygen levels were slowly dropping. He spotted an elderly woman panicking, trying to remove her seatbelt despite the violent shaking. He grabbed her arm firmly. "Sit down and stay seated. Trust me." The woman's eyes met his, a flicker of fear and disbelief meeting the calm, decisive look in Ethan. He was a stranger, yet she obeyed, clutching the belt as if her life depended on it, which, in a way, it did. A flash of fire erupted from the wingtip visible through the window. Panic rippled again. The plane pitched sharply, sending Ethan sprawling briefly, but he regained his footing. Somewhere above him, the intercom crackled with distorted words, the captain's voice breaking. We can't, this isn't responding." Then nothing but static. Ethan's heart pounded. The cockpit was now isolated, and the pilots were clearly struggling to maintain control. He had no choice. Sliding past another panicked passenger, Ethan reached the cockpit door, his hand trembling on the handle. It was locked. For a heartbeat he hesitated, but experience and adrenaline converged. He knew about the emergency access code, the small card airlines issue to authorized personnel. He fumbled in his backpack, pulled it out, and swiped it across the door reader. A beep sounded. The door clicked. He exhaled sharply, adrenaline surging. Inside, the cockpit was chaos incarnate. Instruments blinked red, screens flashed warnings, and the pilots were grappling with the controls, their faces etched with fear and disbelief. The captain turned, disbelief painted on his face. Who are you?" he stammered. Ethan didn't pause. "I know how to glide this plane. I need to help. We don't have time to argue." The co-pilot froze, then nodded, hands shaking as he released the yoke. Ethan stepped forward, eyes locked on the instruments, scanning the altimeter, airspeed, and engine readings. Sparks from the console lit the cockpit in intermittent flashes, casting their terrified faces in harsh, unnatural light. Back in the cabin, passengers continued to scream, clutching seats and each other. The plane lurched again, and the screams escalated, a symphony of terror. Ethan could hear them faintly through the cockpit walls, a grim reminder that the lives of 180 people now rested on a 22-year-old student's shoulders. He adjusted the yoke, attempting to stabilize the aircraft. Every control input had to be precise. Every wrong calculation could mean instant death. A child cried out behind him, A mother begged for safety. An elderly man muttered prayers under his breath. Ethan's hands were steady, but his mind raced, calculating glide ratios, estimating distance to flat terrain, and considering wind speed. Sweat streamed down his face as the plane continued its harrowing descent. Sparks erupted again from the panels. Smoke curled in the cockpit. The stench of burning metal filled his nostrils. And yet, amidst all this, Ethan felt clarity. The fear existed, but it was harnessed into focus, a razor-sharp instinct for survival. Then, with a violent shudder, the plane pitched downward again. The cabin lurched, and Ethan could hear passengers thrown against walls and overhead bins rattling violently. He gritted his teeth, gripping the controls. Every second was measured in heartbeats and screams. The instruments flickered wildly, showing descent speeds faster than normal emergency protocols could handle. One engine had completely failed, the other was beyond saving. The ground was coming up far too quickly, and the reality hit Ethan with crushing weight. This plane could crash at any moment. He glanced briefly at the captain, who looked pale and defeated. I can't stabilize it," the captain muttered. Ethan's stomach twisted, adrenaline coiling tight. He knew he had no choice. He had to take over entirely, guide this plane toward a landing that most thought impossible. The screams from the cabin became background noise, still terrifying but secondary to the singular focus of saving every life on board. He whispered to himself almost inaudibly, "Okay, I've got this. We're not going down, not today." At that moment, the plane pitched sharply to the left, a fiery jolt rocking the fuselage. Bags tumbled overhead. Oxygen masks swung like pendulums. A man screamed, grabbing the overhead rail for dear life. Ethan's heart pounded, but he didn't falter. He tightened his grip on the yoke. The cockpit was a storm of sparks, smoke, and blinking warnings, but clarity shone like a beacon. He had seconds to act, and the entire plane, the lives of 180 strangers, depended on the decisions he made in those few, terrifying moments. And as he braced himself for the impossible, he realized the survival of everyone on board was now in his hands. The cockpit was a storm of chaos. Red warning lights blinked furiously, smoke curling from the engine panels, filling the small space with a choking haze. Sparks danced along exposed wires as the Boeing 737 trembled violently, each jolt threatening to throw Ethan from the floor to the ceiling. The pilots were white-faced, sweat pouring down their temples, hands trembling as they tried to wrestle control from a plane that refused to obey. The roar of the damaged engines reverberated through the fuselage, a deafening reminder that time was slipping away, and death was a heartbeat behind every movement. Ethan's mind, however, was remarkably clear. Years of drone simulation, late nights studying flight mechanics, and obsessive problem-solving boiled down to a single moment of focus. He scanned the instrument panel, his eyes locking onto the altimeter, airspeed indicator, and artificial horizon. Both engines had failed completely. There was no thrust, no lift, and no margin for error. Gliding a plane with the weight of 180 lives demanded precision. One wrong adjustment, one hesitation, and the aircraft would become a death trap. The captain looked at him, disbelief etched across his face. "You're just a student," he stammered, voice cracking. "We've trained for decades for this kind of situation." Ethan didn't answer. Words would do nothing. He reached over and gently yet firmly guided the captain's hands off the yoke. "I know how to glide this plane. Step aside," he said, his voice calm, commanding a lifeline in the storm of panic. The co-pilot hesitated, then reluctantly released his hold, eyes wide in terror and hope. Ethan gripped the controls with both hands, feeling the vibrations of the fuselage reverberate through his arms. The plane was descending rapidly, altitude bleeding away at an alarming rate. He calculated angles, airspeed, and glide ratio in a split second. The nearest stretch of open terrain, a farm field dotted with trees, was barely large enough to attempt a landing. One miscalculation and the plane would clip a tree, or worse, break apart in midair. Ethan's heart pounded in rhythm with the metal groaning around him, yet his mind was razor-sharp. "Brace for turbulence," he muttered, mostly to himself, as the plane pitched sharply. Sparks erupted from the panel above, and the smell of burning circuitry filled his nostrils. Smoke swirled around the cockpit windows, occasionally obscuring his view of the horizon. Every passenger on the plane was relying on him, mothers clutching bobbies, elderly couples praying, children screaming, and he could feel their fear pressing into him like a physical weight. First major challenge came quickly. A violent gust caught the plane mid-glide, forcing it into a bank toward the left. Ethan reacted instinctively, countering with precise adjustments. He could feel the plane shudder, the fuselage twisting in protest. Red warning lights flashed wildly. Sparks from the damaged console hit his arm, burning slightly through his sleeve. Panic threatened to claw its way into his mind, but he shoved it aside, focusing entirely on control inputs, altitude, and trajectory. Seconds became minutes, though his mind moved faster than the clock could measure. "Altitude is dropping too fast," the co-pilot gasped, clutching the side of the cockpit. Ethan ignored him, adjusting the pitch to maintain a delicate balance between losing too much speed and descending too rapidly. The plane groaned as the fuselage flexed under stress, metal creaking ominously. Through the haze of smoke and fire, he glimpsed the field below, a narrow strip of dry land bordered by trees, power lines, and a winding river. It was their only chance. The plane was not designed to land without engines at full weight, yet this was no time for hesitation. Ethan calculated his glide path. He knew the plane would travel roughly 1.5 nautical miles for every 1,000 feet of altitude lost. The instrument readings indicated they had barely enough distance. If the landing failed, the plane would cartwheel across the terrain, killing everyone instantly. He adjusted the yoke, bringing the nose slightly up to slow the descent. Sparks flew from the control panel as another jolt shook the plane. Ethan gritted his teeth, jaw tight, arms trembling but steady. "Hold together," he whispered to himself. "Hold together." Back in the cabin, the panic was escalating. Oxygen masks were half on or dangling uselessly. A young woman screamed as her luggage tumbled into the aisle. A father covered his children with his body, shielding them from whatever might come. Ethan could hear the cabin metal creak with every pitch and roll. He knew that if he didn't act decisively, the panic alone could turn deadly. He had to stabilize the plane before reaching the field, or none of them would make it alive. Then came the first true test. A sudden downward gust of wind pitched the plane violently, tipping it dangerously toward the right. For a horrifying instant, the fuselage seemed to hang in midair, and Ethan felt a surge of fear, sharp, immediate gut-wrenching. He adjusted the yoke, subtly correcting pitch and roll, and guided the plane back toward a more stable glide path. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Sparks rained from the damaged panels above. Smoke was thick, the smell of burning metal now nearly choking him. Yet despite the chaos, he maintained focus. The co-pilot whispered in awe, I can't believe this, you're controlling it." Ethan didn't respond. He had no time for words. He adjusted the flaps, calculated lift and drag, and anticipated the turbulence ahead. The field below grew closer with every passing second. Trees loomed on the edges, a cruel reminder of how narrow the margin for error was. The engines were completely dead, the plane heavy and unyielding, but Ethan's mind moved faster than the aircraft could, predicting every motion, every twist, every jolt. And then, just as the ground rushed up beneath them, another jolt. The fuselage hit turbulence near the tree line. Sparks flew from the panel again, and the cockpit window vibrated violently. Ethan's stomach lurched, but his hands remained steady. He whispered under his breath a mantra to focus. "We can do this. We will survive." The plane swayed dangerously, but he corrected with precision, inching the Boeing toward the narrow strip of land. One wrong move would spell catastrophe. Every second was a battle between physics and sheer will. As the cockpit door rattled from pressure changes, Ethan glanced at the captain, whose face was pale and eyes wide. He saw trust there, unspoken and fragile. Ethan's mind flashed through hundreds of scenarios, none of them easy, all of them deadly if misjudged. He adjusted the controls slightly, guiding the plane toward the clearest approach in the field. Sparks rained intermittently, Smoke stung his eyes and the noise was deafening, yet a strange calm settled over him. It was a focus born of desperation, skill, and an unyielding will to survive. And just as the tree line threatened to intersect their glide path, Ethan realized the unthinkable. The plane might survive this. He had taken control, slowed the descent, and aligned with the narrow strip below. But there was one final hurdle: touchdown. And in that instant, he understood the true danger had only just begun. Ethan's hands were white from gripping the yoke, sweat streaming down his temples as the Boeing 737 shuddered violently. The plane's descent was accelerating, the fuselage twisting under the strain of gravity, turbulence, and damaged engines. Sparks leapt from the control panels, smoke curling thickly, filling the cockpit with the acrid stench of burning circuitry. Red warning lights flashed in chaotic rhythm, illuminating the terrified faces of the captain and co-pilot. Every instinct told him to panic, but he couldn't. Not now. Not with 180 lives hanging in the balance. The co-pilot's voice quavered. We can't stabilize it. We're too low, too fast." The captain looked pale, sweat rolling down his face, and muttered, I can't do this." The words reverberated through the cockpit, but Ethan felt an unfamiliar clarity amidst the chaos. He had run simulations in his mind, practiced emergency procedures with drones, and studied engine failures in excruciating detail. Now, the knowledge that had once been academic was his only weapon. He glanced through the cockpit window, scanning the landscape below. A narrow stretch of farmland lay ahead, a patchwork of green and brown, bordered by scattered trees, power lines, and a winding river. It was barely large enough for a plane of this size, but it was their only chance. Ethan calculated the glide slope, the rate of descent, and the minimum safe touchdown speed. Every variable mattered: wind gusts, remaining altitude, and weight distribution. One miscalculation, one hesitation, and the plane would collide with the tree line, obliterating everything in seconds. "Captain," Ethan said firmly, "step aside. I need full control. We can land this plane, but I need to act now." The co-pilot hesitated, trembling, then slowly released the yoke. The captain's eyes widened in disbelief, then flickered with a glimmer of hope. Ethan's palms were slick with sweat, but his grip on the controls was steady. The roar of the damaged engines vibrated through the fuselage like a living thing, shaking the plane with every second. Ethan's mind raced through emergency procedures. Flaps partially deployed to increase lift. Airspeed carefully monitored, a slight pitch adjustment to control descent without stalling. The plane was heavy, the engines dead, and every second mattered. He whispered under his breath, a mantra to steady his nerves: "We can do this. We will survive." Behind him, the co-pilot muttered, You're incredible," but Ethan didn't respond. Words were meaningless. Action was all that mattered. The plane jolted violently, throwing Ethan forward in the harness. Sparks erupted from the overhead panels. Smoke stung his eyes, burned his nostrils, yet he maintained focus. The ground approached rapidly, a mosaic of danger. Trees, power lines, farm equipment, and uneven terrain, all obstacles that could destroy the aircraft in an instant. He made tiny adjustments, each one calculated with the precision of someone who had spent countless hours mastering impossible scenarios. The plane's glide was imperfect, violent, but controlled enough to reach the field. Then came the split-second decision that could change everything. The field was narrower than ideal, and a series of irrigation ditches and fences threatened to turn the landing into disaster. Ethan had two options: attempt a perfect but near-impossible touchdown on the field, or risk a forced crash landing in a less predictable area. He calculated the risks. A crash anywhere else would almost certainly be fatal for everyone on board. The field, however, offered a slim chance. If he could guide the plane precisely, they might survive. Ethan's mind focused entirely on physics: lift, drag, airspeed, angle of approach. The plane lurched again, violently tilting as a sudden gust of wind caught the tail. The co-pilot screamed, gripping the side of the cockpit. Ethan adjusted immediately, compensating with subtle but critical movements. The plane trembled, the metal groaning under stress, but it didn't break apart. Not yet. He could see the field clearly now, a patch of dry, uneven earth framed by trees and dotted with farm machinery. Every second brought them closer, and every second demanded perfection. Behind him, the cabin was a storm of terror. Oxygen masks dangled uselessly from the ceiling. Passengers screamed, gripped seats, and prayed. A young mother covered her child with her body, trying to shield him from what they all feared was inevitable. Ethan could hear the cries but blocked them out. He could not afford distraction. His mind was a machine running calculations, anticipating turbulence, adjusting for wind, and estimating descent rate with every heartbeat. The margin for error was non-existent. Another jolt rocked the plane violently. Sparks flew from the control panels, illuminating the cockpit in harsh, staccato flashes. Smoke thickened, stinging Ethan's eyes. The fuselage groaned, metal whining under the stress of the glide. He took a deep breath, steadying his hands. This was it. Every skill, every second of practice, every calculation had led to this moment. Failure was not an option. Not for him, not for the passengers whose lives now rested entirely in his hands. Ethan's eyes locked on the field below. It was narrow, rough, imperfect, but it was their only chance. He began adjusting the plane's pitch and roll with extreme precision, angling for a controlled approach. The engines were silent, the roar now replaced by a metallic groaning of stressed airframe. Time slowed. Every jolt, every shudder, every flash of sparks became a part of the rhythm he needed to survive. He glanced at the captain, whose face was pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The co-pilot clutched his harness, trembling violently. Ethan's voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding. "Trust me. This is our chance. I've got this. We will make it." The cockpit shook violently again, and Ethan felt the plane's weight press down like a physical force. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. Then, just as the trees loomed closer, Ethan realized the final truth. The plane could only survive if the touchdown was precise, almost impossibly so. One misalignment, one tilt, one angle wrong, and the aircraft would shear apart on impact. Every passenger's life depended on his ability to execute a landing that even seasoned pilots would fear attempting. And yet, amidst the panic, amidst the screams and smoke and sparks, Ethan's mind was calm, focused, razor-sharp. The field rushed closer. The tree line threatened on both sides. Ethan adjusted the plane's descent, whispering calculations under his breath, guiding the Boeing 737 with precision born of instinct and training. Sparks erupted again from the panels. The fuselage groaned, a terrifying symphony of metal under stress. The landing was still minutes away, but every second carried the weight of impossible stakes. Ethan understood the gravity of the moment. This was no longer a flight. It was a battle for survival. And then he made the decision, the only possible decision. Commit fully to the landing, trust his calculations, and hope that his skill, instinct, and courage would be enough. The plane pitched slightly downward, the engines silent, the field directly ahead. Ethan whispered under his breath, "Hold together. Just a little longer." The impossible choice had been made. Ethan's eyes were locked on the narrow strip of farmland ahead, a lifeline in a sky that had become a nightmare. The tree line loomed menacingly on both sides, the ground rushing up at a speed that seemed to defy comprehension. Every gust of wind, every shudder of the fuselage, felt like it could throw the Boeing 737 off course, into a fatal collision. Sparks danced across the instrument panels. Smoke stung his eyes, and the smell of burning metal filled the cockpit, but Ethan's hands were steady. This was the moment. Every calculation, every hour of drone simulations, every late-night study session had led to this instant. The co-pilot clutched the side console, trembling violently. "Ethan, this is insane. You can't." Ethan cut him off with a sharp, commanding glance. "I can, and I will. Just hold on." His voice carried authority born not of age or rank, but of absolute focus. The captain had slumped against the bulkhead, eyes wide with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and a faint glimmer of hope. Ethan didn't spare him a glance. All attention was on the approach, the tree line, and the narrow strip of dirt below that represented survival. The plane pitched violently as a sudden gust caught the tail. Ethan adjusted immediately, subtle movements of the yoke compensating for the turbulence, guiding the plane into a more stable glide path. Sparks erupted from the control panel, ricocheting across the cockpit, but he ignored them. Behind him, passengers clung desperately to their seats, oxygen masks dangling uselessly, some shouting prayers, some screaming in terror. Ethan could feel their fear pressing into him, yet he focused solely on the mechanics, the glide, the descent, the landing. The field below grew closer, the narrow patch of dry earth appearing impossibly small from this altitude. Ethan knew that even the slightest miscalculation could send the plane veering into trees or ditching into a nearby river. He adjusted the flaps carefully, balancing lift and drag, lowering the nose just slightly to slow descent while maintaining forward momentum. Sweat stung his eyes, but he refused to blink. Each second was precious, each moment a delicate negotiation between survival and disaster. Through the haze of smoke, Ethan could see obstacles, irrigation ditches, fence lines, scattered farm equipment. The ground rose toward them faster than he wanted, and the tree line threatened to intersect their path. He whispered under his breath, almost as a prayer, "Hold together, stay steady just a little longer." The plane lurched again, violently pitching to the right. Sparks flew from the panels, the fuselage groaned in protest, but Ethan countered with precise adjustments. Every movement mattered. Every fraction of a second could be the difference between life and death. In the cabin, chaos reigned. Passengers screamed, clutched seats, and prayed aloud. A young mother covered her children with her body, trying to shield them from the violent jolt of the descent. An elderly man muttered incessantly under his breath, eyes wide with fear. Ethan's voice cut through the cabin sporadically as he shouted instructions over the intercom, urging calm where panic threatened to consume everyone. Yet even as he tried to reassure them, he knew their survival depended on his hands on the controls, on his ability to guide the plane with precision beyond imagination. Another gust of wind slammed into the plane, forcing it into a dangerous tilt. Ethan reacted instantly, twisting the yoke, adjusting the pitch, leveling the wings with microcorrections honed from years of simulation experience. Sparks flew from the control panels, smoke thickened, and the fuselage groaned ominously. Every instinct screamed that the plane was straining beyond its limits, that metal would tear, that disaster was inevitable. But Ethan ignored the fear. Focus was survival. Precision was survival. The field loomed larger now, a narrow patch of dirt flanked by trees and power lines. Ethan's eyes darted to every instrument, calculating descent speed, angle of approach, and remaining altitude. The plane continued to pitch and shake violently, metal groaning, smoke curling around their faces. Every passenger's life was now directly linked to his skill, his calculations, and his ability to act decisively under unimaginable pressure. He whispered to himself, "We can survive this. We will survive this." Time seemed to stretch infinitely. The fuselage shuddered, each vibration sending shivers down Ethan's spine. Sparks rained intermittently from the overhead panels, smoke stung his eyes, but he didn't waver. With the field directly ahead, the plane glided over scattered trees and farm equipment. Ethan adjusted the controls subtly, keeping the wings level, maintaining a precise descent path. The engines were silent, the roar replaced by the metallic creaks and groans of stressed airframe. Below, the ground approached rapidly. The tree line seemed to reach for the fuselage, the gap narrower than anyone could imagine. Ethan's mind raced through split-second decisions. Should he flare the plane higher to reduce speed? Or should he aim directly for the longest stretch of the field, risking higher impact forces? He calculated, estimated, and acted, adjusting the yoke, shifting the weight, keeping the plane stable against the violent wind gusts that threatened to throw them off course. The plane shuddered violently again, a spark igniting from the left engine casing. The cabin lurched, passengers screamed, and luggage tumbled from overhead bins. Ethan's hands never wavered. He could hear the cries, the prayers, the sobs, but he focused on the mechanics. Glide path, pitch, descent rate, obstacles, field length, approach angle, every variable had to align perfectly. A single misstep, a single error, and the plane would crash. Seconds felt like hours. The field stretched out beneath them, narrow and unforgiving, flanked by trees and dotted with small obstacles. Ethan adjusted the yoke to flare the nose slightly, reducing descent speed while maintaining forward momentum. Sparks flew across the cockpit, smoke thickened, the fuselage groaned, but the plane remained intact. He could almost taste the relief of survival, yet he knew the hardest part was still ahead: touchdown. The aircraft descended lower. The landing gear scraped the tops of irrigation ditches. Dust and small debris exploded from the field. Ethan held the plane steady, micro-adjusting pitch and roll, guiding the fuselage along the longest, flattest stretch of dirt. The trees threatened on both sides, the power lines looming closer. Sparks rained from the panels, smoke stung his eyes, yet he refused to falter. He had 180 lives in his hands and nothing else mattered. As the wheels neared the ground, Ethan whispered under his breath, "Almost there, just a little longer." The first set of wheels touched the rough earth with a violent jolt, sending the fuselage shaking violently. Sparks flew from the contact, dust erupted in clouds, and the plane groaned under the impact. Passengers screamed, gripping seats, bracing for disaster, but the aircraft held. Ethan guided it forward, controlling speed, alignment, and descent with microcorrections born of instinct, training, and sheer willpower. The Boeing 737 bounced along the uneven terrain, metal groaning, sparks flying. But slowly, miraculously, it began to stabilize. The wings scraped lightly against the uneven ground, but Ethan held the plane straight. Every second was agony, every movement a fight against gravity, inertia, and damaged systems. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the plane began to slow, dust trailing behind like a scar across the field. Ethan exhaled, his grip tightening once more as the fuselage came to a shuddering halt. Silence fell, broken only by the labored breathing of passengers and the groaning of stressed metal. Sparks still flickered intermittently, but the plane had survived. 180 lives had survived. And in that moment, Ethan Parker, 22-year-old engineering student, realized that he had just done the impossible. The Boeing 737 sat on the dusty field, its landing surprisingly intact but groaning under the stress of the violent descent. Smoke curled from the wings, sparks still flickered from damaged panels, and the faint smell of burning metal lingered in the air. For a moment the passengers were frozen, their bodies still pressed against seats, breathing heavily, trying to comprehend the impossible. They were alive. But survival didn't end at the touchdown. The next seconds would determine if the miracle Ethan had orchestrated would remain a miracle. Ethan immediately turned to the co-pilot and the captain. "Check the engines, any fire." The co-pilot's hands shook violently, fumbling with the emergency switches. "We were okay, no active fire yet." The captain nodded, still pale, his voice trembling. We didn't think," Ethan cut him off. "No time for disbelief. Get the evacuation started. Passengers need to get out now." The cabin erupted. Screams and cries filled the air again, but this time they were mixed with relief and disbelief. Mothers clutched children, fathers hoisted kids onto laps, elderly passengers struggled to free themselves from belts. Oxygen masks still dangled uselessly from the ceiling. Ethan moved quickly, weaving through the rows like a force of calm amidst chaos. His mind catalogued hazards: spilled liquids, dangling luggage, broken overhead bins, uneven terrain outside the fuselage. Every second counted. A delayed evacuation could turn a miracle into a tragedy. "Everyone, remain calm. Follow instructions," Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. Some passengers looked at him incredulously, a young student guiding them with authority amidst what seemed like an impossible disaster. Others obeyed instinctively, drawn to the decisiveness in his tone. He grabbed a young mother with 2 children, helping her to the nearest exit. Dust swirled around them. Sparks from the plane's exterior illuminated the chaos in harsh staccato bursts, and the field outside loomed unpredictable, dotted with rocks, ditches, and scattered debris. Flight attendants moved swiftly now, directing passengers toward exits. Ethan assisted wherever he could, helping an elderly man down a slide and steadying a woman whose foot had caught on the uneven field. Sparks still flew from the wing edges, smoke curling around the fuselage, and a faint hiss of leaking fuel reminded everyone that danger was still very real. The adrenaline that had kept him precise during the landing now fueled his movements, instincts guiding every step as he became a bridge between fear and survival. A young boy screamed, frozen near the aisle. Ethan crouched down, his eyes meeting the child. "It's okay, I've got you. Hold my hand," he said calmly. The boy's small hand found Ethan, and together they navigated toward the emergency exit. The fuselage rocked slightly under the uneven weight distribution of passengers moving toward exits. Sparks from damaged wiring danced across the ceiling, and Ethan's heart raced with every jolt. One wrong movement and panic could escalate, causing injuries or worse. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the field in a dim orange glow. The plane rested precariously, surrounded by the narrow tree line that had nearly claimed them. Ethan guided passengers across uneven ground, helping the elderly, comforting the terrified, and keeping everyone moving. He noticed a small fire had begun near the left wingtip, probably from friction and sparks, but it hadn't yet spread. He directed a group of passengers away from it, his voice calm but insistent. Every action was deliberate, every second critical. A father shouted, panic-stricken, "My wife, my children!" Ethan sprinted toward them, lifting the father's children over his shoulder and guiding the mother out of the plane. Around them, passengers stumbled across the uneven terrain, some tripping in dust and debris. Sparks flew from the plane intermittently, the metal groaning ominously, yet Ethan moved faster than fear itself. He became a conductor of survival, orchestrating movements, calming cries, and guiding terrified passengers to safety. The co-pilot joined him outside, still pale, eyes wide. You saved us," he gasped. Ethan didn't reply. There was no time for congratulations. He continued scanning, moving toward the rear exit, assisting passengers. Smoke thickened, curling from the engine casings, the faint hiss of leaking fuel growing louder. Time was running out. Every second they remained near the aircraft was a risk. He directed people farther into the open field, away from potential sparks or flare-ups. An elderly woman tripped over a ditch, her cane useless on the uneven dirt. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, steadying her. "We're almost clear," he assured, helping her stand. The plane groaned again under its own weight. Sparks leapt from exposed metal edges. Behind him, children clutched each other, some crying, some whispering prayers. Ethan's mind raced through possibilities, calculating which paths were safest, which exits were most accessible, which passengers needed the most immediate assistance. Then a loud hiss erupted from the left wing and smoke darkened ominously. "Move! Everyone move away from the plane!" Ethan shouted. Panic surged, but his presence helped focus people. Mothers grabbed children, men helped elderly, and a stream of survivors moved rapidly into the safety of the open field. Ethan stayed at the rear exit, guiding the last passengers, ensuring no one was left behind. Sparks flickered from the fuselage, smoke curling like a warning, and the hiss of fuel leakage grew louder. Finally, the last passenger scrambled to safety. Ethan stepped back, surveying the field. 180 lives had escaped the plane. The fuselage groaned, the metal strained, smoke thickened, and sparks flew, but no one remained inside. Passengers huddled together, trembling, some weeping, some staring in disbelief at the miracle they had survived. Ethan's chest heaved with exhaustion, adrenaline still coursing through him, but he allowed himself a brief moment to exhale. The immediate danger had passed, but the aftermath was just beginning. He looked back at the plane, still precariously balanced on the rough field, sparks intermittently flying, smoke curling into the dimming sky. Emergency crews would arrive soon, but for now, Ethan remained the anchor for the shaken, guiding terrified survivors through shock, fear, and relief. His hands were scorched from metal contact in the cockpit, his clothes streaked with dust and smoke, yet he moved tirelessly, helping where needed, ensuring that the miracle of survival didn't unravel in the chaos that followed. And as the last rays of sun disappeared, casting the field into shadow, Ethan realized that while the landing had been impossible, the real challenge, the aftermath, the survivors, the human lives still fragile, was just beginning. His heart still pounded with adrenaline, but a new awareness dawned. He had done what no one thought possible, yet he was far from done. The distant roar of sirens cut through the heavy, smoky air, a beacon of hope that had been absent for what felt like an eternity. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police vehicles tore across the uneven terrain, kicking up clouds of dust and gravel as they approached the stranded Boeing 737. Helicopters hovered overhead, their blades slicing the wind with an urgency that matched the pounding hearts of the survivors. The emergency crews had arrived, but there was no time to rest. The plane was precariously perched, sparks still flying from the fuselage, smoke curling ominously from the damaged engines. Ethan, still covered in soot, sweat, and dust, guided the last passengers away from the plane. Mothers clutched children, fathers held onto frightened family members, and the elderly stumbled across the uneven ground. Panic and relief mixed in an almost tangible fog, but Ethan's calm authority kept them moving. "Keep moving. Stay together. Emergency teams are here," he shouted, his voice carrying over the roar of sirens and helicopters. Passengers followed instinctively, some dragging luggage, most carrying children, all relying on the young student who had just defied the impossible. Firefighters sprinted toward the plane, hoses unrolled, axes in hand, ready to battle any flare-ups. Smoke thickened from the left wing, and a faint hiss of fuel leakage warned of imminent danger. Ethan waved the firefighters over, explaining the situation rapidly. "No one is inside now, but the plane is unstable. Sparks, smoke, potential fire hazard. Keep everyone away from the wings." His calm decisiveness seemed almost superhuman amidst the chaos. The firefighters nodded, immediately acting on his instructions, cordoning off areas and directing teams to secure the fuselage. Paramedics moved among the passengers, checking vitals, attending to minor injuries, and comforting those in shock. A young boy clutched Ethan's arm, trembling violently. Ethan knelt, meeting the child's wide, terrified eyes. "You're safe now," he assured him, brushing dust from the boy's clothes. The boy's mother joined them, tears streaming, clutching him tightly. Ethan allowed himself a brief nod of relief before turning back to the chaos. The plane had landed, the passengers were safe, but the danger was not fully gone. Sparks still flared, smoke thickened, and the fuselage groaned ominously under its own weight. News crews began to arrive, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Ethan noticed reporters calling out, trying to get statements from survivors, but he stayed focused on guiding everyone to safety. A firefighter approached him, concern etched on his face. "Are you okay? You were inside the cockpit." Ethan nodded, exhausted. "I'm fine, everyone is out, that's what matters." The firefighter clapped him on the shoulder, a rare smile breaking through the tension. "That was incredible. You saved lives today." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't pause to accept praise. There were still people to check on, still chaos to manage. A helicopter landed nearby, and rescue personnel began shuttling critically injured passengers to waiting ambulances. Ethan directed paramedics toward the most vulnerable, an elderly man with a twisted ankle, a mother with a minor head injury, and a young woman clutching her baby tightly. Every movement was precise, every instruction calculated. He had spent hours focusing on survival in the cockpit, but now, on the ground, his mind shifted seamlessly into crisis management. Panic still rippled among the survivors, but Ethan's calm, authoritative presence anchored them. The co-pilot approached, eyes wide, face pale. I don't know how to thank you," he said, voice trembling. Ethan shook his head, brushing dust from his shoulders. "No time for thanks. Everyone is safe. That's all that matters." Behind them, the last passengers were being loaded into ambulances, still shaking, still trying to comprehend the miracle that had just unfolded. The fuselage of the Boeing 737 smoked ominously, sparks occasionally erupting from damaged panels. Ethan's heart still raced, but a strange sense of quiet pride began to settle over him. They had survived. Journalists pushed closer, cameras flashing and microphones shoved into Ethan's face. "How did you do it?" one reporter shouted. "Were you trained for this?" another asked. "Do you realize you just saved 180 lives?" Ethan took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. I just focused on what I knew," he said finally. "Stay calm, control what you can, and help others, that's it. The rest is luck and teamwork." His words were simple, but they carried weight, capturing the incredulity and admiration of everyone watching. Emergency crews continued to secure the plane, ensuring no fire would ignite and that fuel leaks were contained. Helicopters hovered overhead, news choppers circling, capturing the scene from every angle. Ethan moved among the survivors, helping people to blankets, calming frantic parents, and directing them toward ambulances and emergency tents. Every movement was deliberate, every decision critical. He was exhausted, covered in soot and sweat, but there was no time to rest. Lives were still fragile, shock was pervasive, and the miracle they had survived needed careful management to remain intact. At last, a fire chief approached Ethan, hand extended. "You're a hero, not just for your courage, but for your leadership. You kept everyone calm and safe." Ethan shook his hand, but his expression remained solemn. "I did what I had to do. The real heroes are the passengers for staying calm and the crews arriving to help." The chief nodded, eyes wide with admiration. "Still, you did the impossible." Ethan allowed himself a faint smile, knowing that what had been impossible in theory had just been achieved in practice. As the sky darkened, helicopters continued evacuations, ambulances transported the injured, and emergency crews secured the plane. Survivors huddled together, sharing stories of disbelief and relief. Ethan moved among them, answering questions calmly, helping children and reassuring parents. Despite the chaos and exhaustion, he felt a profound sense of clarity. This was more than survival, it was human resilience. Courage, focus, and teamwork had turned a disaster into a miracle. And yet, as he finally allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, Ethan realized that the aftermath would be intense. Media frenzy, investigation, and recognition. He had saved 180 lives, executed an emergency landing most seasoned pilots wouldn't dare attempt, and guided terrified passengers to safety. But in that moment, standing amid the smoke, sparks, and flashing lights, he knew one thing. The story of survival, courage, and heroism was only beginning to unfold. The sun had fully disappeared, leaving the field bathed in the harsh glow of emergency lights. Sirens still wailed in the distance, helicopters circled overhead, and smoke curled from the damaged Boeing 737 like a ghostly reminder of what had almost been. Yet amidst the chaos, a strange calm had settled over the survivors. They huddled together, clutching children, holding hands, murmuring prayers of relief and gratitude. And standing among them, soot-streaked, sweat-soaked, yet upright, was Ethan Parker, the 22-year-old student who had done the impossible. Paramedics and firefighters continued their work, checking vital signs, ensuring no hidden injuries had been overlooked. A young mother carried her baby in her arms, tears streaking her soot-smudged cheeks, while an elderly couple clung to each other, trembling. Ethan moved through the crowd, helping where he could, comforting the frightened and directing the flow of people to safety. Despite the exhaustion clawing at his body, he refused to slow down. Every survivor he helped reinforced the reality. They had made it. They were alive because of him. The captain of the Boeing 737 approached, his face pale but eyes glistening with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "Ethan, I don't know what to say. You just saved 180 lives." His voice trembled. Ethan shook his head, brushing dust and soot from his jacket. "I did what I had to do. Everyone stayed calm and you all helped me by trusting me. That's what mattered." The captain took a deep breath, visibly trying to steady himself. "Trust you. Trust. You're just a student. You landed a plane in conditions most seasoned pilots would die trying." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he allowed himself a faint, weary smile. "Age doesn't matter. Knowledge, focus, and calm under pressure, that's what counts." The co-pilot, still pale and trembling, joined them. I've never seen anything like it. You didn't just land a plane, you commanded it. You kept everyone alive when all hope seemed gone." Ethan nodded, though the gravity of what had just happened weighed heavily on him. He had been trained in theory, practiced endlessly, but nothing could have truly prepared him for this. News helicopters circled closer now, reporters pushing forward, cameras flashing, microphones extended. "How did you do it?" shouted one. "What went through your mind when both engines failed?" asked another. Ethan exhaled, trying to gather his thoughts amidst the cacophony. I focused on the things I could control," he said, voice calm but firm. "Stay calm, follow procedures, help others, that's it. The rest is luck and teamwork." His words, simple but powerful, seemed to carry weight beyond his years. Media crews captured every moment, the smoke curling from the plane, the exhausted survivors huddled together, and Ethan, soot-streaked and resolute, moving calmly through chaos. Social media exploded almost instantly, videos circulating with captions praising the 22-year-old hero who saved 180 lives. Messages of gratitude flooded in from across the nation. Airlines, government officials, and everyday citizens heralded Ethan's courage and skill. Yet even amidst the fame, he remained focused on the immediate reality, ensuring every passenger was safe and stable. Firefighters had now contained the minor fire near the left wing, preventing it from spreading. Helicopters ferried the injured to nearby hospitals, paramedics provided first aid, and emergency crews meticulously checked the fuselage for hidden dangers. Ethan moved among them, answering questions, providing details about the landing, and ensuring that every aspect of the emergency was documented accurately. Despite the chaos, a sense of calm began to take hold. The disaster had been averted, and 180 lives had survived against staggering odds. Later, as the field emptied and the last helicopters lifted away, Ethan stood quietly at the edge of the site. The Boeing 737 sat there, battered and scarred, a testament to the miracle that had just occurred. Survivors, now safely transported to nearby shelters, waved and cheered as Ethan's figure became a symbol of bravery. Relief washed over him, but exhaustion hit harder than adrenaline ever could. His hands ached, his muscles trembled, yet there was a profound sense of accomplishment. He had faced impossible odds, and somehow he had prevailed. In the days that followed, Ethan became a national sensation. Interviews, magazine covers, and news specials told the story of the 22-year-old student who had landed a Boeing 737 with 180 lives aboard. Pilots, aviation experts, and engineers praised his quick thinking, calm demeanor, and precise control. Universities and flight schools invited him to speak, eager to hear firsthand how someone so young had accomplished something considered nearly impossible. Yet amidst the accolades, Ethan remained humble, insisting the focus remain on the lives saved rather than on him. Government officials presented Ethan with formal recognition for bravery and heroism. In a ceremony attended by survivors, emergency responders, and national media, he received awards for courage, leadership, and quick thinking under extreme pressure. Families approached him, some with tears streaming down their faces, clutching his hands in gratitude. "You saved my child," one mother whispered. Another survivor said simply, "You gave us a second chance at life." Ethan nodded, emotion tightening his throat, overwhelmed by the scope of what had been accomplished. In quiet moments after the press had gone, the cameras had stopped, and the adrenaline had faded, Ethan reflected on the day's events. He remembered the cockpit, the chaos, the smoke, the sparks, the deafening roar of engines that refused to function. He remembered the passengers, their fear, their prayers, their trust. He remembered the field, the narrow landing strip, the split-second calculations that had decided between life and death. And he understood that heroism wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about focus, courage, and the will to act when everything seemed impossible. Ethan Parker, once a student who had studied flight in theory, had become a national hero. He had faced the impossible, defied disaster, and saved 180 lives. His story would be told for years, inspiring generations of pilots, engineers, and ordinary people to act with courage under pressure. The Boeing 737 remained on that field, battered but intact, a monument to human resilience, quick thinking, and the extraordinary bravery of a 22-year-old who refused to let panic dictate fate. And as he finally allowed himself to sit quietly, watching the last traces of smoke drift into the night sky, Ethan realized a simple, profound truth. Ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when faced with impossible odds. And in that realization, he found peace, knowing that today, he had made a difference that would echo far beyond a single field, a single flight, a single moment.